Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world. And thank you for joining us for this latest in our series of scenarios for a post-pandemic webinars, where different authors from the book will be sharing their chapters. And we have 4 of the contributors here today to talk to you, and they will introduce themselves in a moment. I will just take a second to share with you, in fact, what we're going to do is change of plan. We're going to have each of the panel members introduce themselves for 15 seconds. And while we're doing that, I'm going to share a short poll with you to get you thinking about the pandemic. And there are 2 questions in this poll. The first question is, from the scenarios we presented in the book, we want you to think which is the most likely for your country in the next 3 years. And secondly, we want you to answer which of those scenarios are you personally doing the most preparation for. So we'll put those 2 questions up. They'll stay up while the panelists are introducing themselves. We just have to choose one option from each. So let's just go around. I'm going to go as I see you around my screen. So top left for me is Lee. Lee, do you want to just take 15, 20 seconds to introduce yourself and who you are? And then we'll come back to you to talk more about your chapter.
Sure. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are. My name is Lee Shupp. I'm a trained futurist from the University of Houston Futures Program. I'm based in Silicon Valley, and I have been working in innovation consulting, mostly for large tech companies based in Silicon Valley, and helping them bring products, brands, and services to market. So I've worked on a lot of fun new technologies, and I love thinking about the future.
Okay. Let's go to Sylvia.
Hi, everybody. So I'm Sylvia, based in Silicon Valley as well. I've been helping companies mostly on their go-to-market strategy to the US, European companies coming to the US for the past 15 years. And I love writing about the future. And that was an amazing opportunity to be part of this. My chapter is called The Generation Zoom Classroom, and I'm happy to talk about it later.
Okay. For those who are just joining as we're going around the panel, there's a couple of questions in the poll that you should see on your screen that you can answer while the panelists are introducing themselves. Joe, let's go to you next.
Oh, yeah. Good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone. Great to be here. I'm Joe Tankersley. I'm on the other side of the United States, located in Florida. I am a futurist and an author of speculative fiction. Most of my focus is on how do we use narrative and storytelling to help people better understand what might be coming. And most of my work tends to be, like everyone, with a wide range of clients, but I focus a lot on communities and nonprofits as well. No, glad to be here.
Great. And Alex, who's a co-editor of the book.
Hi, hey everyone, how are you doing? Thanks for having me. I'm Alexandra Whittington. Please feel free to call me Alex. And I'm a futurist researcher, educator, and writer based out of Texas. So I'm right here in the middle of the country. I teach part-time at the University of Houston, and I also work on a variety of futurist research projects. And I wrote a chapter about post-pandemic homes, and I'm excited to share with you guys some of my reflections on it.
Excellent. So before we start talking to the panelists about their chapters, I'm going to draw the poll to a close now and share with you what the people who've contributed so far are saying. So we can see on the screen the first question, which scenario is most likely for your country in the next 3 years? And it looks like the majority of us are going for safe but hungry. So there's a positive view that our countries are going to eradicate the pandemic, but have a deep and prolonged downturn. So we're going to trade livelihoods for lives in that one. Very few believe we're going for poor containment, and then slightly more believe that we're going for the BIP economy model, where we'll have poor containment but a vibrant rebound. And no one seems to be lining up with our leaders in most nations who think that we're going to contain it or eradicate it and have a vibrant rebound. We have no faith in our leaders, people. And interesting enough, that most people are preparing for that scenario of safe but hungry as well, that we eradicate the pandemic, but we have a deep and prolonged downturn. It's really interesting. This is the first time where, in recent weeks, where the long goodbye hasn't won as the scenario that people think is most likely for their country. But most people are preparing either for the VIP economy or safe but hungry. Very few people anywhere say that they're preparing for the long goodbye, even though that's the scenario that they think is most likely in most of the previous events. So I'm going to stop sharing that one and let's move on. Let's invite Joe to tell us a little bit about, Joe's going to take about 10 minutes to tell us about the ideas in his chapter. He's not going to give it all away because then there'd be no point you buying the book. You could just come to all the webinars. But Joe's going to share with us, then we're going to have a little bit of a chat. We're going to have a polling question, and then we're going to bring the panelists into chat about that. If you have questions, please, please, please put them in the Q&A box, and please vote for the questions you'd most like to see answered. If you have comments or just general points to make, put them in the chat, but make sure that you select the option of to all panelists and participants, because then everyone can see your brilliant thoughts, not just the panel members. And we'll be so busy talking and chatting to each other that we may not pay too much attention to what's going on in the chat. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Joe. Let's put the spotlight on Joe, put him center screen. And the rest of us will just sit around like an honor guard while Joe shares with us. The floor is yours, Joe.
As long as the rest of you don't throw tomatoes, everything will be fine, I think. As I said in the beginning, most of my work is around how do we craft stories that will help us create the future that we're really interested in. And so I tend to look for opportunities most of the time. When this particular call went out, I went to the other side and really focused on what I see as a potential aftershock from the pandemic. My scenario for the future is a little bit on that sort of negative approach is what we're looking for. And the reason for that is my reaction to what I was seeing early on in terms of what didn't seem like particularly good long-term thinking taking place. The focus was very much on this is going to be short, it's going to be quick, we're going to be incredibly optimistic, and everything's going to get back to normal. And part of that I understand, because this is a serious, difficult disruption. And so we do need those optimistic stories. But at the same time, I think as futurists, we need to make sure that we're looking at as broad a possibility of what might be happening, both good and bad, in terms of how that goes forward. So for me, the way I think about disruption is like this. If you throw a pebble into the water, you create a series of ripples. We've all seen that and done that before. The biggest splash at first might be the pebble, but the ones that might have the most long-term impact and the impact furthest away from that moment are going to be the ripples. And in a futurist point of view, those are the second, third, and fourth order results of any particular event. And so I think those are the things that we really need to be thinking about most in terms of our future and some of the aftershocks from this particular crisis. I wanted to focus specifically on the healthcare system for a couple of reasons. One, it is at the center of this particular crisis, but it's also a perfect example of what I think are the areas that are most at risk. It is a system, at least in the United States, that is shaky at best. We talk about how great it is and how we do deliver, world-class care to so many people, but the structure underneath that is really not as robust and resilient as we would like to believe. And as we started looking at that, I remember there were three reasons why we all decided to stay home in the beginning. The first was to decrease the actual number of people who got the disease, because if we weren't out, we wouldn't be spreading it. The second was to have the time to develop a tracking and treatment plan so that as we began to get back into society, we would be able to control the spread and not have continued growth, something we haven't done at all, at least in this country. But the third one was we wanted to avoid overloading a very vulnerable system, particularly in the United States, and I think this is true most places. There just aren't that many ICU beds available for extremely sick patients because you don't typically have hundreds or tens of thousands of people that you need to deal with in that area. So we wanted to come up with a way to spread the virus out over time, even if we couldn't find a solution to it. In this country specifically, and I think largely around the world, we have totally forgotten that third goal, it seems to me. We've forgotten, in fact, in places like Florida, where I live, that there is any COVID-19 crisis at all in our rush to try and reopen. And I think that's going to turn out to be short-term very bad for us. But what I am most concerned about is what does it mean long-term? So this is the question I wanted to address. What are the second and third order impacts onto our healthcare system? With a couple of assumptions. I assume one, that the pandemic might last as long as 2 years. We'll ultimately get it somewhat under control, hopefully through a vaccination, possibly through herd immunization. That's going to cost us a lot more lives, but it is an option. But then the question is what happens, say, in 2021, 2022? The first order that I see happening is a massive reduction in our healthcare workforce for 2 reasons. One, by then, we have totally burnt out the people who have been dealing with this day in and day out for 2, possibly longer years. And so many of those people, particularly people who are largely near retirement age now, and our healthcare system relies upon those people to a significant degree, will start to simply retire because they're burnt out. That will be magnified by the fact that we're going to have major cuts in government healthcare spending, which means we won't be able to replace those people. So what does that mean? The next order of impact is that once you have less people and less money, you have to have significant reduction in the services being offered. That's going to come at a particularly bad time because we're also seeing a huge increase in the aging population, who are the people who need the most services. So we have these 2 forces hitting at the same time, which just simply magnifies the fact that the system is not going to be delivering. And so the focus for my little story for the book was on what I call the fourth order. What happens when we start to imagine what draconian measures we might actually have to create to ration medical care? And from that, I came up with a story that's titled When the Future Was Bright. And it's looking back on a time when things were actually better. And it's pretty negative and pretty dark because I wanted us to stop and pause for a moment and say, if we're not planning for what these third and fourth order impacts might be, we really might be dealing with much more serious problems going forward than we've been thinking about or we imagine that we might be facing. I'll finally just sort of wrap it up by saying this. Any kind of foresight project is not meant to be a prediction to say, this is the future and there's nothing we can do about it. The only value in this story, negative as it is if it sparks you to ask yourself some questions. Number one is, how can we avoid this, particularly with healthcare, if it's an area you're dealing with? The second thing is, if you're in another area of business or government, look at those specific parts of your system that are most at risk, that don't have resiliency built into them, and ask yourself, what might happen if we don't think about those second, third, and fourth orders going forward? If we think about them now, if we begin to plan for them now, I do think that we can create a future in which my story will have just been, thank goodness we managed to avoid that one. At least that's my hope for the future that I'm trying to plan for in the future. Rohit?
Thank you, Joe. Great question. Before we get the panel's view on this, let's get your polling question up and see what people have to say about the question that we've got around your topic. So this is really about how do we think countries will handle the pandemic and, in a sense, this idea of calling the end of the pandemic. So we'll keep this up for a little while people can vote on it. And I'm going to bring the rest of the panel into the conversation now and get each of us to just respond firstly to what Joe had to say. Let's start with you, Sylvia. What's your reaction to what Joe had to say? What resonates with you? Where do you think we might end up differing in our, in the way things play out?
Sure. No, first of all, Joe, I read your chapter and I really love it. I find it actually pretty poetic and beautiful. I love the way you've written it. So I can see you have a background in that area, so I'm not surprised, but it was a really beautiful chapter. I like the perspective you take to both talk for the 2 years to come and do that in 15 years. And so I think that perspective really gives us a lot of input on what we are living right now. Also, I share with you this concern that we are reopening probably too quickly without having already dealt with what is the real issue at first, which is the health issue. And I see also in the comments about virologists telling that we are still not done with that thing. And I think people want to move on, and there's this need and excitement about opening up the country, opening up back to social life. And at the same time, and I think that's our role as futurists, we still feel that things are really not over, that it's probably just the beginning of a new sequence of events. So, yeah.
Right. People are putting questions into the chat box. Let me just remind you, we're not going to answer questions in the chat box because it's too distracting. Please put all your questions in the Q&A box. If you've typed it in the chat box, please copy it into the Q&A box. That gives everyone the chance to vote on it as well. So, Alex, your take on Joe's. Joe, did you want to come back on anything that Sylvia said?
No, I appreciate that perspective, and I'm totally in agreement with her. I think we're at a moment where we really need to think about, are we making the best long-term decisions? And I don't think we are, unfortunately.
Right. Alex, your take.
Yeah, well, I just want to echo what Sylvia said. A really nicely written chapter, great read for anyone who hasn't read it yet. Definitely read Joe's chapter. I like the aspect of that chapter that emphasizes the problems with the U.S. healthcare system. I think that was the most important purpose of that chapter to me as a reader. That's what I took away from it. Like, we really need to open our eyes to the inhumanity, without giving too much away about the chapter, but the dehumanizing effects of the fragmented, completely poorly distributed, and absolutely unfair healthcare system that we have in the U.S. And we've seen that play out exactly in the statistics. Most of the people who are getting very sick and dying are non-white people. So it's really affected marginalized populations in a big way. So I feel like the chapter is really a huge wake-up call, and I hope some policy makers read it too, because it speaks exactly to what is, just a huge problem that's getting worse by the day, basically. That if we don't, it's a ticking time bomb, I guess, in America. That's my opinion about healthcare. So I think it's a really good chapter in the sense that it's one of those scenarios that gets people to want to think and want to act.
Excellent. Lee.
Just want to say I love reading Joe's writing. He's just a great writer, and it's really engaging to read his chapter. And I agree with his view on healthcare. In America, we pay the most and get the worst results for healthcare of any of the G8 countries. And it will be really interesting to see if this situation leads us to get something closer to single payer, which we sort of inched towards in the Obama administration and have now backed away from significantly. See if we get a healthcare system that is actually more in line with what other democracies are doing.
Yeah. For me, the interesting thing about what this has revealed is that the wealthiest and theoretically most advanced economy in the world is struggling. And we know that this virus travels around the world in seat 43C of airplanes. And, we have an issue that while any country is at risk, we're all at risk. So I celebrate for New Zealand and Taiwan that they say their economies have opened up now. 20,000 people went to a rugby match in New Zealand yesterday, and they're really happy. But they can only be really happy while no one else is allowed into the country. And the challenge we've got now is that this isn't just a US healthcare issue. This isn't just a domestic healthcare issue for developed nations. Our real challenge is, how do we build health infrastructure in the poorest and weakest nations who are showing some of the fastest rates of growth now, much later into the pandemic. And, we're seeing Brazil saying they're not going to report numbers anymore. And Brazil's in that category where their leader is saying it's not real. But they've literally got a runaway virus now. They're not even really counting deaths in any meaningful way. And I think that's one of the concerns, that in some of these countries, they don't have the infrastructure to provide the care. They also don't have the infrastructure to count the true cost, the true impacts in terms of infection or death. And so the question I would bring to you, Joe, and it's a little unfair because you're not, an expert on global health systems, I know this, but how do we move from this very parochial view of fixing our own system or doing what we need to seeing this as a truly global issue that needs a truly global response? We did it in the great financial crisis. We worked out that, you know, the big powers had to work together to fix this. We don't seem to be making anything like the same moves. And in fact, we're trying to cut the legs out from underneath the World Health Organization, who might be the only player who could coordinate that. So how do we move forward? Not just you, Joe, but anyone who's got a view on this. How do we start to attack this problem?
So I'll be ridiculously brave and try to take a pass at that. This is by far the biggest failure of our institutions around the COVID-19 crisis, the inability to have a unified global response. And that is directly related to a failure of leadership, I think, from a handful of large nations. And it just, you know, the timing couldn't have been any worse. How could you have possibly brought all these elements together? Unfortunately, I don't see a short-term solution to that. Maybe after November, things change in the United States. Some of us hope it will. And we have people who want to do global unified approach. In the meantime, the only thing that I am optimistic about is how the second levels of government are starting to begin to try and work together. In the United States, it's at the state level. You're seeing some cities that are trying to do this. And we do live in a global world where it is possible for, say, a place like Los Angeles to be a role model for Mumbai or a place in New Zealand or anywhere else, and for them to connect. So I think it requires us to be really imaginative about where the leadership might exist in the future. I don't think it's going to come at the national level, and that is really distressing.
Right. Anyone else have a view on this global dimension of it? Sorry, Lee, were you about to come in there?
Yeah, I'll yield the floor to you, Rohit. Did not mean to.
No, I was just asking if anyone had a point.
For sure. I think that, yeah, and the difference between the financial crisis and now has been the rise of populism and nativism, where there's just not the level of global cooperation among global leaders that we had even a decade ago. I think Joe's right. It's like what's been happening, at least in the US, is that we're seeing the second tier of government really step up, state governments and local governments. And we're starting to see regionalized responses, which I think is really interesting. I think we're starting to see that internationally as well, that blocks of countries will start cooperating with each other, and there'll be these building blocks of regions that are coordinating a response in the absence of a global coordinated response.
Sylvia, Alex, any views on the global aspect?
Yes, so I totally agree about having a global governance. At first, what we need is to have unified government in our own country, and today the response haven't been unified within the US, to mention my country. So I think at first there's more local issues before having a global issue, and when you have leaders that's polarized instead of leaders that's unify, it's already very difficult. Also, we're talking a lot about leaders, but also a lot of things are coming from the ground, from the field, and I think that's also where leaders have to listen to, like listen what is happening. We have plenty sources of information today where you can listen to what it is like to have an online funeral, what it is like to be a teacher in a remote area, and so on. And I think that's how you listen exactly what is going on today, and you can first get a sense of what is going on in terms of mental health. I see a question about mental health, and I hope we can talk about it later, but there will be a lot of consequences that we are not really able to evaluate, to assess in their totality. And I think investigating more what is happening in the different areas of the country, and not just the most vocal people, will be a first step. And I really believe in task force, in think tank, when you have the different voice of the different stakeholders to take decision, and not just top-down decisions coming from the leaders.
Alex?
Yeah, I would just circle back to what was said earlier about the local governments gaining more of a place in people's minds when it comes to, you know, decisions that affect our day-to-day lives. And I think that the social movements that we've seen in the US and around the world here following the murder of George Floyd, it shows how we can get more involved at the local level. And I think that the convergence of these two events could lead to a more healthy civic society in America. People are waking up to the fact that, what our elected leaders do affects our lives, literally. In the case of the PPE shortages and stuff like that, it's not really been played out so clearly in society until here recently with these events. So I think that the potential for this to push another civic renaissance in America, that would be a really cool positive outcome of a couple of really bad events.
Great. I'm going to ask one quick question of you, Joe, that is an easy yes or no answer from Steve Wells. Was the conclusion of your chapter inspired by Soylent Green?
No, but I certainly understand why someone might see the connection with that. I wasn't thinking about that directly at the time.
Or spending too much time on the It's a Small World ride at Disney.
That also could drive anyone to that kind of negative future, but yeah.
Great. Okay. Let's share the results from your poll. So, any surprises there?
Certainly not based on what's going on particularly in where I am in Florida. Although I will say, because I try to find some optimism whenever possible, I do think there's a real possibility that we will see the situation get worse before suddenly we start to go, wait a minute, we need to go back and readdress that original idea. Because there was a plan from the very beginning. The health experts said, close down, set up testing, tracing, work on creating vaccines and treatments, and we might be able to beat this. And I think we will probably at some point try to follow their advice. At least I hope. Right.
Excellent, excellent. Let's take a couple more questions before we move on. So we've got a great question here from Rex Miller. While we focus on the risk and cost directly from the pandemic, how do we weigh and calculate the cost to mental health and the economy? Let's take two of you answering on this, and then we'll take two of you answering on the next question. Any thoughts?
I'll take a pass at it just because Rex and I have had this conversation. So, the economic cost, I think, is the easiest to measure. The mental health cost is much more hidden, but certainly a very severe problem that we're going to have to deal with. I don't think that these things are necessarily in opposition to each other. I think we think about the pandemic from a systemic approach, which is we have to keep as many people from dying as we can, as many businesses from collapsing as we can, and as many people from suffering long-term mental health problems as we can. But the only way we can do that is if we're honest about what's happening, if we've got good data, and if we've got government that's willing to provide some kind of safety net at all levels. And that's what we don't have right now. But that's, to me, how we balance those. It would be great if we could be perfect, but we won't be. Life isn't.
Right. Anyone else want to come in on the mental health issue? How we weigh the costs? I personally think it's an incredibly, as you say, an incredibly complex factor. And there are so many influences on that it also varies from country to country, and the natural inclination of the population towards happiness or a kind of deeper, darker outlook. So I think we're seeing some politicians trying to use this as a reason to open up, and I fear that will just make things worse. That actually the rush to open up will make the mental health issue worse, because people will go back to work and within 4 weeks they'll lose their job because the business that they're employed in just doesn't have the level of activity to keep them employed. And I don't know what's worse, getting furlough payments from government and keeping some income coming in, or going back to work and then becoming completely unemployed and joining the ranks of the 40 million or whatever. Let's take another question. I think we've answered that one. From Steve Wells again. Joe, how do you see the dynamic between healthcare products and service providers and the healthcare providers stroke payers? Steve's written a question that's longer than his chapter in the book. changing as a result of the pandemic. Will the US government stance remain along the traditional party lines, public health care provision? Is the US healthcare system going to change? This is my summary, as a result of this.
So my personal opinion, I think there are two things we're going to see more of. One of them, I had this experience the other day. I had my first telehealth appointment. They certainly do not completely replace all of the things you need to do face-to-face, but we'll start to see technology being used. We'll see artificial intelligence improving some of our healthcare. So at that level, I think we'll see some real change. The question of the economic structure, I don't know. I think it's up in the air. I think clearly if we see a political swing in this country, expanding universal health care will be top of the new agenda because of everything else that's going on. But I don't think any of that's guaranteed at this point. I just, I don't know what the future is in terms of healthcare and how we make the system work.
Okay. Anyone else want to have a final word on the shape of the US healthcare system?
I agree that the outcome is highly unlikely, but I think there's probably more pressure for universal healthcare now than there's been in a long time because so many people are out of work and healthcare has been attached to your employment for so long. So we'll see.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Joe. Great session. Got a lot of questions. There's more questions. We'll come back to some of those at the end, I think, if we have time, because there's lots of good questions coming in. So now let's move on and have Sylvia talk to us about her chapter. The floor is yours, Sylvia.
Sure. Well, so as said before, I've been mainly a strategy consultant, and but I still have a double background both in business and social science. And not only with the recent event, but for the past 5 years, I've been asking myself a lot of questions around the evolution of our world and our future. So I've been launching an initiative called Silicon Humanism, where I specifically dedicate my research to the future of education and the future of work and the future of well-aging. So that's why in my chapter, I specifically underline the education aspect, the generation aspect, and also the grieving aspect. I'll be talking a little more about it. Also, as said, I love to write. I'm a heavy writer, and I really consider future fiction as a fantastic tool to bring people to really put themselves in their future self's shoes. So I'm always very interested in imagining and discussing the future, and I was so amazed at this opportunity to be part of the book. So maybe I can tell you a little more about the chapter in particular. So my chapter for the Aftershocks and Opportunity book revolves around a history class. It's taking place 17 years from now, and there's a classroom of high schoolers, and they are studying with their teachers the COVID crisis over the 2-year time span of events that took place after the start of the sanitary crisis. So there are different levels in the story, and I think 3 of them can actually open conversation. So I mentioned like the macro trends, the rush reopening of the economy, how this is a confusing time also for medical research, with a delayed vaccine, a second strain of virus, and the consequence comeback of the pandemic. I also mentioned something that's very dear to me, but I'm asking questions around segregation policies by health status, as well as military intervention to calm down protests, which unfortunately resonated even more recently. And beyond the medical, economic, and social impact of the pandemic, also we realize that the wounds turn out to be much more acute and profound and more intimate than anticipated at first. So I think what's interesting in the chapter, and I hope I can share that with my readers, but it's to put in perspective the current events. Especially at a first level, I relate and anticipate what could be macro trends, some of which are unfortunately already taking place, such as public order actions in a very polarized society. Through the character of the teacher, I mentioned the effects of the health crisis on the economy, also medical research advancements, social policy, also politics and elections. And for example, I talk about colored badges that were issued to people according to their health status, and how they end up going to different schools, different stores, different restaurants, different churches, and so on. Therefore, the question that I want to ask at this point are more about what draconian measures may be required if existing measures fail to prevent a significant second wave of infections. And how far should the state of emergency go? Should the military be involved at all? I'm also asking, like, is segregation ever legitimate? And should we encourage a separation by health status at all? So these are more like the social policy and society questions. I think we should all ask ourselves, and our leaders especially. At a second level, I also wanted to explore what it means to teach history. So I took the historian's eye to tell the story, because I'm very interested into how are we going to teach history specifically to the children born today in this time of crisis. And this opens another line of questioning around, like, how do we convey our experience to the next generation? And more largely, how can we help, like, this generation Alpha to reflect on their roots and define their identity in this post-pandemic world and in this new paradigm. And finally, there's probably a more subtle level in the text, more of the subtext, where I evoke the intimate experience of the crisis, the inner wounds, the impossible grief, and I illustrate this through the personal story of the teacher who we understand has lost someone dear in the crisis. And here what I want to ask is, like, how are individuals going to grieve for the family and friends they lost in anonymity? And how can we make sure that individuals find a space to grieve for the loved ones they lost in the crisis? And as I was saying earlier, like, when we listen to the voices of people who have been through this, when we really hear their testimonials, you realize, or just if you read the obituaries, like, people are always saying, let's postpone this to when we can meet all together. Let's celebrate the life of this person when we can meet again in person, because the social and physical aspects of dealing with the loss of having a physical funeral is really a big issue. And that's why also we were talking about mental health. I'm sure there will be a lot of PTSD as well for the students who had to live through this experience of having distance learning, which has been underlying inequalities, students being left alone at home, sometimes with parents not present and not able to help them. There's been a lot of mental aspect that I'm sure we are underestimating today. So all these questions finally converge into one of my main concerns relating to the crisis. How do we profoundly heal as a society and this large-scale death count? And how can we help people to heal and recover from the profound ones of the crisis? So I hope you enjoy the chapter, and of course I'm happy to answer the questions.
Great. Well, while we're getting the panel's responses to that, let's also put up Sylvia's question so people can vote on this. And this is all about what we think the main characteristics might be of that generation born after 2010. So let's run that while we put the panel up, and let's bring everyone in to talk. Alex, do you want to perhaps start with your reflections on what you heard from Sylvia and that shift in society and the values that exist in both the generation that are coming through, but also the generation that are trying to relay that experience to them?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, no, I love the context and the setting of this story. I think it's a great chapter. And like Sylvia, I love talking about the future of education. I think it's a hugely important topic. what strikes me about the chapter and about what you asked, Rohit, is how every generation, at least in my understanding of how generations work, have an event that can shape them, that shapes their zeitgeist, right? Their perspective, and it forms them in the way that they relate to one another and see themselves. So I'm very interested in the concept Sylvia put forward here, where the pandemic is this generation shaping event. And as futurists, it's interesting because it tells us something about where we may be going in terms of what this generation's future needs, expectations, worldview is going to be like. I mean, this is something valuable from marketers, to educators, to policymakers, to healthcare providers, like Sylvia was saying about, the mental health issues that could arise. That may be a separate epidemic, won't it, or couldn't it, from this generation arising from this very shaping event. So I would just ask that, I guess the takeaway for me from this chapter is that people who work with the young populations, college educators, school educators of all ages, I guess, counselors and so forth, understand and explore what it means to live through something like that when you're growing up, at a young age, to go through something that's really, quite jarring for adults even. It's scary for grown-ups. Imagine how kids feel. So I think that's something that we need to talk about. And maybe, like Sylvia says, that can happen through actual curriculum, education. Maybe it comes down to really thoughtfully teaching about this moment, preparing and planning for how we teach about this future history, and making it, so that it helps society be the society that we want.
Okay, Lee.
So this evokes to me the generational work of Strauss and Howe, that have the four generational archetypes, and the generations cycle back. Definitely worth a read if you're interested in that sort of thing. I think this is definitely a defining moment for this generation. It's going to shape them for the rest of their lives. I have an extended family member who is a senior in high school right when this hit, and she had her whole kind of senior year taken away, all the stuff that kids normally do, and has been really depressed as a result. I attended her Zoom graduation ceremony earlier in the week, which is really well done for a Zoom graduation, but all the rituals that we got to do in high school, going to the prom and, all the parties at the end of the year and all that stuff, just gone, and really devastating for this generation, I think.
Joe.
Well, I think Sylvia's story is just a really brilliant piece, particularly in terms of the way she deals with the much larger elements of the COVID-19 crisis beyond just health and economics, and really gets down into what are the long-lasting impacts. So on that part, I really think it's powerful. The two things that really stand out for me, particularly given what's happening since she wrote the piece, right? One of them is this question of how COVID-19 might play into inequality and inequity, and do we result in having haves and have-nots? And fascinating topic there that's really worth looking into. And then, of course, the other piece, which is so incredibly relevant given what's going on, particularly in the United States right now, is this question of how do we package history? When, will this next generation, what will their COVID-19 hero statues be, or who will they be? And how will we begin to think about this process? And so I think she really takes the conversation to a level that's so critical in terms of thinking about it for the future. So brilliant job. Thank you for sharing that, Sylvia. And I was really loved those moments in it. I think are really important.
Yeah, I mean, for me it was really interesting, again, this idea of what is the footprint of this pandemic on the younger children coming through, and then on the children who are born as a result of it. I watch my niece's kids and my nephew's kids, and they're between the ages of 3 and 6. And so this is a massive period of their life that is totally abnormal. And they're learning behaviors in this pandemic that are going to be quite hard to shift, i.e. that the entire day is playtime, that they can learn when they want to and when they feel right. They're actually learning more, I think, than if they were in a normal classroom. But they're also starting to ask questions about, well, how will it be when I go back to school and there are a lot more rules? And, what will happen if I can't talk to my friends, or I can't be next to them? and all of these kinds of things. And one of them actually went back to school the other day, but just to look at it from across the road, to try and get a sense, and this is a 6-year-old, to try and get a sense of what life was like now, because his mother, well, he'd agreed with his mother, he wasn't going back right now, but just to try and get a sense of it. And I just wonder how dark the footprint is going to be for those kids, because on the one hand, some are having a fantastic experience of learning at home, having parents around who can invest in them. Others are having a terrible experience. But then when they go back, and there's this sense of pressure on the teachers to get them through what they've missed educationally and get them back into the rhythm of the exams and everything, how dark is that footprint going to be long term? And how does it change the whole nature of contact between teachers and kids and all those kinds of things? It feels like that is one of the biggest areas where we're going to see the most long-term impact. There's some questions come in as well. So the first one from Ken Hammock to Sylvia. They're just asking you to talk about the role of women leaders during and after the pandemic. Not directly related to your question, but the floor is yours.
That's a large question, and of course part of this topic, but also opening all new questions. I can tell you a little about what I've seen happening in France, especially as leaders were talking about the crisis. There was this newspaper first page with just faces of, let's say, 50-year-old white males talking about the crisis. And there has been like a big movement of women rejecting it and really asking for their place. Like, you only saw pictures of women on the field being nurses and trying to deal with the crisis, and then you had males in power position talking about the crisis, and there was really a disconnect. So I heard a lot of voices from women trying to find their place, and I think there's been a rejection when you see a webinar with just five males talking. It's like women don't even want to attend it anymore. So I think there's been an effort. I'm talking more about France. I've been really seeing that in France. I think it was more diverse in the US, but in France it was really a big phenomenon. And more women are now invited to talk and share their mind. So I'm talking more about the experts, not exactly about the leaders. I think leaders are still another topic, but it acts at every level. So I think already if we have more women expert talk, it's already a good thing, because they have been living it. They've been trying to balance having a job and having, I have 3 kids at home, and I try to do my best to do my job early morning or when they nap, and it's a struggle. And I had this funny thought the other day. Like, we used to talk about work-life balance, like, when you work too much, how do you find time for your family? And I think today work-life balance is more about when you have your family to take care at home, when do you find the time to work? So our work-life balance topic has been totally reshuffled. So I think that's a big issue, but today understanding that we all, like males and females and others, we have been all living the crisis in a way or another. So we all have something to say about it. It's not just something that belongs to male leaders today. It's really something we share, all of us, as a community in a way.
Anyone else want to come in on this issue of female leaders?
I'll just chime in to say something I've observed. I was actually working on this topic on another paper. And one thing that I was thinking about is how the pandemic has possibly raised the status, elevated the status of some female-dominated professions such as nursing and teaching. And so I came up with this when someone was like, seriously, come up with some positive outcome related to women. And it kind of racked my brain. And that's one thing that came to me, is at least We have seen parents relating to teachers, parents dealing with the homeschooling situation, saying like, wow, teachers don't make enough, we need to pay them more and all this kind of thing. And then of course, seeing our nurses, on the front lines, such brave heroes. And those are both, longtime women dominated professions. So I would just say there's some hope on that side, at least.
Okay, let's take another audience question from Steve Wells again, another co-editor of the book. And he says, when we look back from the future in history lessons and streamed documentaries, will we see the COVID-19 pandemic labeled as a health crisis, an economic crisis, or a social crisis? What would be our kind of core way of describing this? Let's start with you, Joe. You've been quiet for a while. Let's bring you in. What's going to be the predominant storyline?
Well, I think, particularly as I was listening to Sylvia and Alex talk, all of the above and more. I have a good friend from Vancouver who has been working in the sustainability movement for many years, and he likes to say that, the climate crisis is not a crisis about man and nature. It's fundamentally a crisis of how do we think of ourselves. And I think COVID-19 is turning into that. How do we think about education? How do we think about the value of so-called essential employees? I mean, these questions are so fundamental, and I don't think in January we thought we would be asking them. So I really think it might be an institutional, social, cultural question long-term as we think about an opportunity to really change.
Yeah. Alex.
Yeah, it's so systemic. It's so interconnected. It's just, I think that's the new part of it, is seeing more people, seeing the world as interconnected. As you said in the beginning, it's not just about the failures of the U.S. healthcare system. Now we know that the failures of the U.S. healthcare system can harm people in Spain and China. We knew that, a lot of us knew that, but now people get a real sense of that with this kind of event. So I think that's, it's so interconnected.
Any thoughts on how we'll categorize this crisis?
I agree. It's sort of all of the above. And I think what's really interesting is that we have this time when people are sheltering in place and they have more time to reflect because we're out of the normal cadence of our hyper busy lives. And we're seeing these problems come at a scale and a starkness that we've not seen before at a time where we actually have more time to reflect and think upon them. And I think that that's bound to have some kind of effect.
Yeah, I'm going to bring you in a second, Sylvia, but I guess my view will be a lot of this will depend on where you're looking from. If you're coming from within the healthcare system, you're going to pitch it as a healthcare crisis that requires the system to be better funded, better resourced, redefined, redesigned. I think if you're coming at it from a government perspective or a business or financial markets perspective, we'll talk about this as an economic crisis and how we need to manage the economics of it better next time, and how we need to make sure that we're protecting the economy more, whatever the social and medical protections are. But I think from a broader societal perspective and the chattering classes will very much see this as a societal issue and a social thing, and all of the social challenges that have got revealed as a result of this, the inequality that's been revealed in terms of who gets affected by this, who loses out on schooling, whose jobs went away, and all of the social issues that really got uncovered. And then, we were talking about this before the webinar started, how, of the 115 chapters that got submitted for the book, a lot talked about the social issues that would come up because of the crisis, but no one talked about the fact of us all having so much time that we would be able to put the spotlight on a particular social issue, as in the case of George Floyd and the treatment of Black people by the police and the systemic treatment of them. And I think we'll have a lot more of that. We'll have a lot more focus on the systemic injustices and systemic weaknesses in society. Whether we'll do something about them, I think will be very interesting, and it will vary by country. But I think, it will all depend on which lens you choose to work from as to how we're categorized. Sylvia, do you have any thoughts on that? And we'll also share with you the results of your poll. But just start, how do you think the crisis will be categorized?
Yeah, I would say also all of the above. I think it's really intertwined, and it starts as a health crisis, but then it has direct economic consequences, it has social consequences, it has mental health consequences. So for me, it's really intertwined, and that's the characteristics of the big global crisis. It's at every level. So I think we're really dealing with something global and complete.
Let's share the results of your poll then and see any surprises here in what answers people, what answers people gave. No one thought that they would be preppers ready for whatever else comes. Bubble children and baby Zoomers seem to be the winners here.
It could have been interesting to follow this along the crisis, because probably 3 months ago it would have been different. Yeah, well, asking this question, why I wanted to put this question is because I think if you think about persona, there are going to be different types of behavior in the future. And I think that's kind of the one I try to formulate and that I have actually noticed around. And I think in my mind, also in my observation, at first I saw a lot of baby Zoomers behavior, like this unified identity from online and offline, these kids being so comfortable being in front of the camera and no more boundaries between online and offline identity. But as things have evolved, I've heard a lot more actually about freakouts, like the kids starting to be afraid to be too much in front of the screen and what the hack of Zoom means for them. And I see how they react, and I think it's a mix of using a lot of technology, but also of the bubble children effect. Like there's a lot of danger around, and they tend to crystallize our fears in their own behaviors, and that's where the generation effect is actually taking place. They take up clues from our behaviors. They see their parents at home all day, for most of them, and they take clues of the world outside is dangerous. I'm online and I'm not sure about how this whole environment works for the less than 15 years old. It's really like a whole new world for them. So I would personally actually see a little more freakouts coming, which is like linked to also the mental health issue we were discussing previously. But I'd be happy to have your opinion if we have one or two.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, we're seeing in the UK, and I don't know whether this is happening elsewhere, but there's a group who are now sort of taking this attitude that it's not about them, that this is something that happens to other people and not them. So we're seeing this rise in rave culture. This weekend in one city alone, there were 2 raves with about 4,000 kids in them, just basically getting together in massive, massive groups and just saying, we don't care. It's not about us. We're not going to be affected. We're just going to get on with our lives again. And I think, I don't know which of your categories they would fall into, or is there another category for them? But, I think it also depends on where you are in the world again. I think, kids in Taiwan and Singapore would probably have a very different attitude than maybe kids in the UK or the US.
Of course.
Yeah. Okay. So I think it's probably time to move on. But just at the point where I was going to move on, we've lost Lee. He's taken a bathroom break. And we can all see that he's done that. So we're going to swap. Alex, are you okay to go next?
Sure,
yeah,
definitely.
So let's give you the spotlight, and then we can all laugh at Lee when he gets back. Loud. Oh no, Lee's come back. Then let's still go with you, Alex. We're going to put you last, Lee, because you took a bathroom break at the.
You lost your spot.
You lost your spot. You snooze, you lose. So Alex is going to go next and talk about her chapter, and then we'll.
No worries.
Thanks, Lee. Okay, well, thanks again for joining me here on this panel. This is great. I'm enjoying hearing about your chapters, and I'm going to talk a little about mine, which is on the post-pandemic home, or the post-pandemic homes, I guess. And basically in the chapter, what I talk about is the home office of the future. cleanliness and sanitation in the home in the future, and the relationship between the smart home and the smart city in the future. And of course, I'm not looking much more than the next couple of years out. I'm just sort of, the chapter goes into some of the changes that have taken place during the pandemic and how they might look should they stick around. And rather than go over that, I'm actually going to talk about 4 issues that I think the chapter raises related to the home and to the future in general. So I've got 4 things that I thought, are sort of major uncertainties or kind of issues that the future home in the post-lockdown time, let's say, it could raise for us. So it's going to be 4 things. The home becomes the apparatus of the surveillance state. This is my first item. And this basically has to do with something we've talked about a couple times here, the track and trace aspect of the pandemic. In order to, open everything up again, for this whole thing to end, right, we need to know who's had it, who, where they've been, who they've talked to. And the smart home has been discussed as a way to make that happen, right? With a combination, I mean, we've already seen some apps, I think, on people's phones. In Asia, I think they're using some various apps. Some are voluntary, some are not. I think there's one in India that's not voluntary. You have to use the app that monitors where you've been and who you're talking to and all that stuff. And so one thing I was, kind of exploring is the reality of manually doing the track and trace versus the, let's say, ease of automating it through smart homes, through mobile phones, through wearables, different devices. I think this is a major uncertainty for the future, because for the near-term future, because we do have to get to where societies need to get to where they know that the cases have been eradicated, that we're done, it's over, it's been, people have had it, we know who they've talked to, and everyone's been tested and all of that. But it really does seem like smart and intelligent, IoT, Internet of Things type of technology might be the most practical way of going about it. And if that is the case, then I think especially in America, but in other nations too, we have a really big conversation on our hands about the cost to personal freedom and the benefit to society as a whole. So I think that's kind of an interesting question that it leaves us with in terms of what our homes look like, and what they do. Will they ultimately, join with a bigger neural network or whatever you want to call it, big system that monitors everything you do? And will the pandemic be the reason, right? The accelerating tipping point, I guess, for why that happens. Okay, the second thing I wanted to look at is the idea of robots doing more autonomous work in our homes. This kind of draws on the smart home concept as well. And this is basically looking at, what kind of future are we setting ourselves up for? And this is not a new question in future studies, but what does it mean to have robots working for us in our home? For a lot of us who have been on lockdown before, let me just say, like I said this in the last webinar, I've been on lockdown previously because of weather issues where I live. Here in Texas, we've had these, big floods and hurricanes and stuff. So there are more reasons than just the pandemic to go on lockdown, first of all. Let me just say that that's a premise of the chapter. But the idea of being stuck in your home for a long period of time, and the reality of it, can actually create, I think, new opportunities for why we would want autonomous or robotic helpers in our home, whether it's for cleaning, whether it's like delivery robots to get stuff over to us, whether it's home health care, the telemedicine that Joe kind of mentioned, or even if it's robot companionship. A lot of people were in their home alone, and some people went to Zoom parties and stuff to kind of, bridge the gap. But maybe it's possible that home robot companions of some kind could be used to keep people company in these kinds of situations if they are to happen again. And like I said, my premise is sort of that the pandemic is the current lockdown, but it's possible that climate change or other unexpected events could cause future lockdowns. Something to think about in terms of like home design and what we want in our homes. All right, so the third thing I looked at, or the third sort of uncertainty that I think popped out at me from my chapter, is how work and school at home, working at home, learning at home, has revealed a lot of socioeconomic inequalities. That's something we've talked about today quite a bit. And, I just read a survey, just to throw some data in there. I just read a survey it was published in Fast Company, I think, that 60% of Silicon Valley CEOs said that they will consider downsizing or losing the office altogether. And I also read another statistic, I think this was locally in Texas, that thousands of kids were lost during the pandemic. Like there's thousands of school children that teachers, principals, school administrators have no idea whatever happened to them. They never heard from them again, and it's probably for a variety of reasons. But the main core reason there, we think, is socioeconomic inequalities. So I guess that the pandemic served to sort of highlight these sorts of things that we need to look at in terms of our society. We've touched on this many times, but it became sort of a mirror on our society. And then when you think about working from home, educating from home, it literally puts a window on your home life. And so it's been an opportunity to see what we're exactly dealing with. And again, I think it was eye-opening for people. So in terms of like the future of the home, I wonder if there will be programs or plans to overcome those inequalities. Like if we know that kids are not able to access their classes because they don't have the technology they need at home, maybe we'll have some kind of social programs to fill that need in the future, to outfit your home with what you need to learn well. And then the fourth thing I looked at was, well, this is sort of, again, a big uncertainty that I think that the pandemic has helped highlight, which is, does remote learning work? Having looked at the future of education for a while, kind of looking at the scenarios, having worked on the scenarios, online education is kind of like the main future scenario out there. I mean, it's not that we don't have a plan B to that. We futurists do, right? We can think of lots of futures, but when you ask the average person, what's the future of education? I think they say, oh, online learning, remote, whatever, something like that. So I think that we're going to find out whether online learning works, what about it works, what about it doesn't work. And we may find a lot of this out in the home. It may be possible that there will be studies, there will be programs where kids and teachers, parents, communities work together to figure out how to make online learning work, or figure out, the whole online learning situation that we really haven't had the opportunity to study in depth until this has happened to, this event where everyone was forced into online learning. There was actually an article in the Wall Street Journal that said it doesn't work. It didn't work. This proved it. It doesn't work. But I don't think the jury is out yet. And I think that the other connection here is that there's a strong link between public health and public schooling. This connection was drawn out during the pandemic, which is that we have to understand the connection between the health of our students and our community and whether or not we can then educate our children under those conditions. So that was sort of the four uncertainties that I thought we might look at after the pandemic, and it's all related to stuff going on inside of our homes.
Fascinating stuff. Thank you, Alex. Let's bring the panel back to the fore. Let's take reactions from, oh, we've lost you, Alex.
Oh, sorry. So sorry.
Exit stage left.
Bye.
Right, Joe, let's start with you. Reactions to what Alex said, those shifts in the home that she talked about. Which do you think are going to be the most prominent, or is there anything else that you think is going to change around the dynamic of the home going forward?
Sure, I'll take a swing at that. One thing, of course, that strikes me is this is in some ways a return to the future. 100 years ago, most of this stuff happened in the home. The sort of offloading to institutions is a modern phenomenon. And so the question is, can we do, what does that mean? And do we look at history to maybe learn from that? The two places I think Alex really hit some interesting notes for me was this idea of having robots in homes. When you combine that with the massive catastrophe that's happening at nursing homes, for instance, I imagine a whole new scenario around aging in place, and part of that requires having the help to do that. And so automation certainly would be a part of that. I think would be really interesting. To her question about whether or not the home becomes the government spy on us, all I would offer in terms of that one is people have given up their privacy for a 20 25% off coupon to their local retailer. So I can only imagine that that is a possibility. The scary part is will we have the political and social will to make sure that if we do see this huge shift to more stuff being our responsibility at home, will we make sure that those kids don't get lost? That's the most important issue I think that we have to focus on. But great stuff to really contemplate.
Sylvia, your take on the home and the dynamic.
Yeah, I was actually very inspired by what Alexandra said, and I love your chapters, and especially the one around the home, because you take the home as a mean to reflect on many other things, and I think it's very brilliant the way you do it. On the specific things you mentioned, first, I totally agree with the robots and what Joe just said. I think the well aging, which I'm actually studying, is really one of the areas of opportunity for this. I was thinking especially there are all new technology, like where you have an AI able to detect when people are falling and to call assistance so that someone comes on. And so I think that's going just to help all this technology democratize and being in more homes today. But also at the same time, I'm thinking about like web conferencing. I know in many opportunities, in many occasions, the elderly had the opportunity to do web conferencing and they don't want to do it. Like in nursing homes, they have equipped, in France again, they have equipped nursing homes with web conference technology. People just go in a room which is sanitized, they have a Skype meeting with their family, and they just don't want to do it. They want to see people for real, actually. They prefer the phone plus people seeing the people from real, their family for real, than using the technology. So we need to adapt also the technology to this age category. Maybe if I have the time, another comment, I was very interested also in what you say about the future of education. And I think there are really two levels. It's about being equipped, like we need to make sure that as many children as possible are equipped with Wi-Fi, with laptops and so on. But also there's a question around dropouts. Even if they are equipped, a lot of children still drop out. So it's not just being equipped, it's how do you keep them motivated? How do they understand the tool? And I just heard a testimonial around the platform iReady, which we're using the public school. And it was more like, you have a questionnaire and it tells you like, try again, and it's not personalized. And the children, they are just desperate in front of the tool. They are, I don't understand what I do wrong. Nobody is explaining it to me. And they need more personalized. But this personalized helps and support cannot happen with what the teachers are able to do today. It's hard for them to talk personally to 25 or 50 or 30 children. And also it depends on the age of the students. I think for the younger one, definitely distance learning has been like almost a catastrophe. They need immersion, they need affection, they need emotional, social-emotional learning, and it's not happening well as to social distancing and social learning. And for colleges, it's different topics that we're dealing with. It's inequalities. In the dormitories, they all have the same room, but when they do their webcam from home, you see they have different homes, and it really shows and displays like in front of everybody what are the inequalities. But well, I could talk forever. I find all your chapters so inspiring. So thank you so much for writing them.
And let's also launch Alex's poll. This is a multiple choice one, so you can vote for more than one option here. While you're doing that, let's bring Lee in. Lee, what's your take on the home?
I wanted to say that it's a really great chapter. I really enjoyed reading it, Alex. So thanks for writing it. A lot of stuff to talk about. I mean, I think right now the home has now become a much more full activity center than we're used to it being. That we've sort of outsourced a whole bunch of things to different physical places that we're used to going to, and we can't do that now. So we're in this time where homes are really being reinvented and have to be much more full-featured and fully functional. Going to some of the themes that Alex talked about, I think we're going to see more robotics. We've seen robots as sort of personal assistants or sort of robot friends in Japan already. I've already owned a robot dog, which was given to me by some colleagues as a joke, which actually came to like and became a point of discussion. I think the Zumba is probably the entry robot device into a lot of houses because they're sort of fun and they have personality and they're super convenient. And we'll certainly see a lot more of that, especially since robots can't carry COVID-19. In terms of education, I think there's some really interesting tensions there. I think a lot of education really is around the social interaction kids have in school, and that's particularly true in college. So a lot of the folks that I know here in Silicon Valley having discussions about whether they want their kids to actually sit out a year rather than do homeschooling on Zoom, just because they feel the interactions are so different when you get people in the same physical place. And for a lot of prestigious colleges, the network is a lot of the reason you go to like a Princeton or a Yale or a Stanford. So distance education really robs you of a lot of the value of those institutions. And in terms of AI and surveillance, I think that happens to us a lot more when we're mobile than actually when we're at home, because we can hide behind a gateway at home. This is the single best surveillance device on the planet. As long as you have a mobile phone, all kinds of your activities are known to all kinds of different people. So I think when you're mobile, I think your activities are much more apparent to both business and government than when you're home. And we're certainly seeing governments ramp up surveillance and using COVID-19 as an excuse to bring in additional surveillance on their citizenry. And that kind of stuff very rarely gets rolled back once it's implemented.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things that struck me about the chapter was, you know, we talked about it when you were writing it, was, again, it's kind of what's the difference between reasonably well off or middle class and wealthy families and what they can do with the home, and what about the poor and the people who don't have the tools at home or have very small spaces? You know, are we going to see some sort of model that starts to fund them? If we're going to be spending a lot of the next 2 years or beyond living and working from the home and spending a lot more hours there, is that going to be seen as a social necessity to provide support to adapt those homes? And then you think about, you know, other parts of the world. I was listening to something yesterday about Mumbai, where they're saying that you've got 1.5 million people living in less than 1.5 square miles in Dharavi in the slums. I mean, just trying to get your head around that is incredible. And you've got people who are used to not spending much time there. They live in small family units below factories. They really only go there to sleep. They eat off the street, you know, from street vendors. They spend most of their time at work, and a lot of work is on the street, or they're at school, or they're at jobs. When they're in lockdown, they're in crisis because the physical space they have that we would call their home doesn't fit that model for them at all. It's not something that they've created with a view that this is where I take my leisure, this is where I spend a lot of time connecting. It's just the place where they sleep. And I wonder whether this could actually, in this situation, could create some real tensions at that level, or force governments to create different kinds of accommodation for the poorest of the poor, because we know they're going to have to be in these units. And we've seen it's possible to build this stuff at speed. We saw what China did and the speed with which it built those massive hospitals. We've got huge convention centers that probably aren't going to be used very much for conventions for a couple of years. You know, there's a lot of space out there that could well get repurposed, and then office buildings that you know, people don't want to use anymore. There's potentially the physical resource there. It's the question of whether we have the will to repurpose it, to allow families to have more space to actually call home, and to have some of the kind of conveniences we're talking about, but also even face some of the challenges we're talking about around, you know, the IoT and surveillance. Alex, let's get your take on the poll and see what your take is on the results of the poll. Home office, the clear winner here, and home gym.
Yeah, and one thing I reflected on recently was how a home office was probably once very much a luxury. You know, a home computer was once a luxury. So was a mobile phone. So was a laptop. So it may be that eventually having your own green screen and like podcast ready, you know, soundproof room, or school ready or whatever may just become a normal part of life as a result.
Yeah, possibly. Let's also take, anyone else got any reflections on the poll results before I move to questions? We have some questions that are coming. Okay, let's kill the poll and let's take some of the questions. Ken Hammock has asked a question. They're getting longer again, folks. Yuval Noah Harari recently said that if the home becomes the new office and our IoT devices get tracked and traced, shouldn't the social contract go both ways? What transparency are governments, including policing and businesses, offering to balance this privacy security compact? Who wants to have a go at that one? How do we deal with the whole privacy, surveillance capitalism, Big Brother, living an entirely tracked and traced life? How do we deal with that? What do we become when everything is quantified, digitized, and analyzed by forces in the cloud?
I think a lot of it depends on the country that you live in and the culture that you live in. I know that my friends in the EU are much more cognizant of privacy, and the EU has much more stringent privacy protections than the US. In the US, we're pretty slutty with our data. We trade it very easily, and we trade our privacy away very easily. I think we have really low expectations for what we get in return, sadly.
Right. Anyone else? Are we going to fight back? Are we going to take back control of our data and put data brokers in there to prevent governments, corporations using our data? Or is this a one-way track we're on now?
In the US, I keep feeling like at some moment people are going to wake up and fight back, and I've been disappointed and wrong every time that I've thought that. And I've thought it pretty continually for the last decade.
Sylvia, Ken, Joe, Alex.
Yeah, I like that question. It's a hard one. I would say a main feature of social contract is trust. And I've heard also a lot recently about to have this work, you need to trust the company who are tracing you, or the instance, the government instances that are doing so. And that's why it has to work both ways. Like if they track you and you understand why they are doing it, people are more willing to do it than if it's a blurry area where you don't know what's going on. So I agree that transparency is definitely what we need to see, but I don't know if we are in the position to act on this.
Right. Alex?
Hard one.
Yeah, well, I think, this is a pretty long going uncertainty. How much of our private information or freedom do we want to give away in exchange for safety, convenience, or whatever it might be? And I do agree with something Lee said, which is there are probably cultural reasons for why we feel one way or the other. One thing I've read is that Eastern cultures tend to have a higher tolerance for AI and stuff like that. For example, the social credit system in China, because they have a more collective worldview to their culture, whereas Western societies are going to be more individualistic. So there's also that to look at. It's not just, okay, privacy or data or whatever, but it's really more about, a deeper held worldview that is time, it takes time to change that kind of thing.
Joe, any take on that one?
Well, the only thing I would offer is in terms of Ken's question about, what will business and government offer in terms of transparency. I think there are two pieces to that. One is I think we're finding that we're not waiting for them to offer. One of the things I think is going on in the world today is while we're having all this polarization and we're having all these political battles, we're also seeing that governments are not getting away with as much as they might have in the past. Because we can collect just as much data, we largely journalists and people like that. So I think part of it will be a push. The other part is the pull, and some businesses are starting to realize there's a competitive advantage to being able to say to people, we will respect your data, we will respect your privacy, we will protect it for you. Imagine once we get through COVID-19 and in 2024, it's the great data disruption. When everybody's data gets stolen or hacked or something like that happens, that will then speed that even further, I think. So long term, it'll balance out somewhat, I believe, is the optimistic view.
I think it's very interesting because we're in a place now where we talk about governments and organizations and businesses and how they use our data. But when you look at it, it doesn't matter what the government says or the politicians or the corporation as in its leadership. We're talking about thousands of individuals who have access to our data and what they choose to do. So I'm sure Zuckerberg doesn't have a clue half the time what's going on inside Facebook and the different projects that all the people inside Facebook are cooking up all over the world. And I think that even if we might have trust in a corporation, it's very hard to have trust in the 20, 50, 100,000 people who might work in that organization and for whatever reason decide to go a step too far with our data. And I think that's the challenge, that, you know, in a world where people are still motivated by rewards, promotions, getting, you know, more funding for their project, what they might do with our data is what really concerns me. It's not so much the corporate policy. And, you know, you see so many films about the US government where the politicians are saying one thing, but the intelligence agencies are doing something completely different. You know, how do we stop that? Particularly if they're not telling you what they're doing. And that's my fear, is that whatever the policy is, underlying it, there'll be a lot of breaches. Time for another micro essay from Mr. Wells. He says, there is an interesting dynamic between social structures, e.g. education, and technology, in brackets, edge computing, to provide for future lockdowns or the permanent change of work and education. So that's the context. Where and how will these changes be integrated into home building and remodeling? So how do we factor in all of this stuff? I think we touched on it a bit, but is there anything else we would say about how we factor in these shifts in society into the design of our homes? Will it become mandatory for homes to be IoT connected, wired for 5G, wired so you can stream in video education? Will screens be just built into the home so that every child can be educated? Is that the path we're going down?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it certainly is a vision of the future that's been out there for a while for different reasons. But I would just, you know, play the devil's advocate and say, how can we not, in light of the suggestion, for example, that our local schools here have said that every school child will have their temperature taken before they walk into the building every day once they go back to school. The logistics of that happening is insane. I mean, literally just trying to get all the kids into school on a normal day is one thing, but taking every single kid's temperature, you know, the line backing up, they're going to have to start school an hour later just to take all their temperatures and then pull the ones out that have a fever and then deal with that. So I totally get, you know, the invasion of privacy and that it's a kind of a crazy, unrealistic, super tech future to talk about. But at the same time, if we're moving to where we need to monitor something for health reasons or for other reasons, there's no better way to do it. I mean, it's insane to think a school nurse can take hundreds of kids' temperatures every day for the rest of our lives, you know.
So does that drive us naturally towards just giving them kids wearables that monitor all sorts of things?
Yeah, I think the convenience factor. What do y'all think?
And then a van just pulls up and pulls them off the street because something's happened.
I agree. I think we're going to see a huge uptick in personal health monitoring devices, so that people have better and more accessible information about their own health than they can get now.
Right. Cool.
So there was I just, as a sort of a scan hit related to that, there was a note I saw the other day about a school system in Ohio, I believe, that was planning to do an experiment before COVID-19 with beacon tracking, so that they would actually know where every student was every minute of the day while they were in school. And it's created a huge pushback, even though it wasn't related specifically to you know, testing and tracking for the disease. So I think there's a real challenge here as we try to figure out how do we balance all of that in a way that makes sense.
Great. Okay, I think we're going to end this slot here because we now need to move on to Lee's piece. Thank you very much, Alex. Really interesting topic, and I really like the dimensions you brought out, the kind of higher level dimensions of the questions it raises for society. Because I think it really does raise very big questions, kind of go to the heart of who we're going to be and how we're going to live. Now let's hand over to Lee to talk about the interesting issue of the future of America, or the near-term future of America. You're muted, Lee.
Excuse me. Can you give me the ability to share my screen? Rohit, can you give me the ability to share my screen?
Yeah, I've done that. I just made you a co-host, so you should be able to share.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm going to show some slides, because I'm a visual person. That's probably more interesting than you looking at my face. I wrote 4 scenarios on 4 alternative futures for the US, looking at basically a 4-year time frame, so going into the election of 2024. And to do that, I really looked at 2 critical uncertainties. The first one is the shape of the economic recovery. And you've probably heard these letters used a bit by economists, but I'll explain them a little bit. A V-shaped recovery, it means we have a really steep decline, but a really fast and robust recovery. A U-shaped curve means that we have a much deeper downturn and slower recovery. And some people have actually substituted the Nike swoosh for the U. The W means that we have a much more jagged and uneven recovery, where the recovery comes in spurts, and we have a lot of ups and downs as we recover. And an L-shaped recovery basically means that we go into a depression similar to the Great Depression of the 1930s. So the scenarios look at each of those 4 economic recovery curves in turn. The other critical uncertainty is the outcome of the 2020 US election. That the prospects of that have shifted day by day. The US election is really important because there's 2 very different competing visions for the future that are coming up in the election. And this not only happens at the level of the presidential election of Trump versus Biden, which are very different visions for the future of the country, but also with the outcome of the Senate, because in the US, the Senate has a disproportionate effect on judicial appointments and the confirmation of different government posts. So basically 4 scenarios in my chapter. The first is the American Reich with a V-shaped recovery and Trump reelected and the Republicans retaining control of the Senate. The second is renewal with a U-shaped recovery and a Democratic sweep of both the presidency and the Senate. This third is rough sledding, which is a W-shaped recovery with Biden elected and Republicans retaining control of the Senate. And the last is the greatest depression with an L-shaped recovery, which means we're in depression with Biden elected and Republicans retaining control of the Senate. So that provides 4 really different worlds that we could be living in that are really different environments for the US. And I focus on the US because I think what happens in the US right now, for better or for worse, has a disproportionate effect on the rest of the world. The American Reich assumes a V-shaped recovery and Trump reelected and the Republicans retaining the Senate. And in this scenario, we really see a continuation of the last 4 years that we've had, with a party in power that believes that the ends justifies the means, that there's really no need to fit with democratic institutions or precedent, and that you can see a continual dismantling of government institutions and a willingness to change the rules to benefit the party that's in power, where it really becomes about sustaining power for the party that's in power rather than keeping things fair, equitable, or anything like what we have seen in past American traditions. Renewal assumes a U-shaped recovery and democratic sweep. And in this scenario, we see a reversal of the last 4 years, a rebuilding of democratic institutions, from the inside out, and re-engagement with the US, with the rest of the world. And this assumes that a lot of damage has been done in international relationships, and that as the US becomes more re-engaged with the world, it's no longer in the position of leadership that it has once assumed, that it's much more a partner, and it takes a long time to win back trust from the rest of the world after losing it so adroitly in the current administration. Rough sledding assumes a W-shaped recovery, that Biden is elected and Republicans retain control of the Senate. In this scenario, we have a very jagged economic recovery in fits and starts. So we see a reopening of the economy and then it closing again as the virus spreads. We see a gridlocked government where it's very hard for Biden to get things done with the Senate blocking him. We see the Senate continuing to block judicial appointments and continuing to try to influence the judiciary and to really slow and gridlock government. And this creates a really long, slow slog and a lot of uncertainty going into the 2024 presidential election as people are unsatisfied with the state of the government and blaming both parties. The last of the four scenarios is the Greatest Depression. This is an L-shaped recovery, which is really a slow or no recovery at all, which assumes that the virus continues to spread, the economy continues to be slow, Biden is elected, but we see high unemployment, low economic recovery, and this puts the U.S. in a very similar situation to that of Weimar Germany in the 1930s, where we see populist movements starting to increase, a lot of dissatisfaction with current institutions, and a lot of pressure for change going into the 2024 election. So those are the four different alternative futures, again, based on the shape of the economic recovery and the outcome of the 2020 elections. They could be four very different worlds that we're looking at in 2024 as we go into the election that follows. I will stop here and we can then open up for discussion. Back to you, Rohit.
Right, let's come to the spotlight, put you all back in gallery. Well, reactions. I think we ought to start with the people living in North America. Who wants to go first? Your reactions to the scenarios. Sylvia, lead off.
Thank you, Lee, for sharing. What I like probably the most about your analysis is the way you build the methodology and the quadrant around the dimension of election, because we mustn't forget that this is one of the big components of what is going to happen in the future. And I think the polarization is growing even stronger in our country. And definitely, what I'm very interested actually to see in your scenario is also how you integrate the latest events happening in the US and following George Floyd's death and the protest. How do you include that in your scenario? And did it change your mind since you wrote the chapter? Or do you have an opinion of yourself in which direction we're going? I'm sorry, I'm answering with another question, but actually,
No, it's all good. I welcome the interaction and thank you.
And sorry, I've just launched Lee's poll as well. I forgot to launch it straight away, but it's there for people to vote.
Yes, Rohit will laugh because I'm going to hedge on my answer to which scenario I'd pick until we see the results of the poll, because I don't want to influence it unduly with my own opinion. And I think it may also change depending on what day it is in America.
Right. Alex, your reflections on what Lee had to share.
You know, I think it's a really cool way to process the upcoming election, you know, to sort of put it into those different scenarios and let us see what the different outcomes might be. You know, I think that the first one is definitely the scariest and hopefully the least likely, if I can, you know, just reflect on my own opinion. And I think that honestly, I don't know that you could have picked better indicators, you know, for what's going to happen in America. The economy, or the recovery, I guess, and the election, because these are two things that are such like of tremendous impact right now. I think that they're really great uncertainties to frame the chapter with. So I hope the first one doesn't happen. And I think that they're really good for people to have in mind as we prepare to vote this fall. I hope that you know, get them out there.
Thanks, Alex.
Joe.
So it's interesting, quite by accident, I picked up The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck a few weeks back and started reading it. I don't know what I was thinking, right? Not the best time to be doing that. But what it reminds me of, and what I think is really most intriguing about Lee's chapter, is his question: what does this mean for 2024? And at least two of these scenarios, and maybe three, in my mind, suggest that 2024 could be even more radical as the tension gets so intense between the American right or the Great Depression, if we have those two futures, what's that pushback or what's that snap that happens in 4 years? And that to me is just really what I think is a real interesting depth to what Lee brings to this chapter, and I'm fascinated. And like everyone else, I certainly have my preference of these four, but I'll wait and see what the poll says too.
Right. One of the things that really struck me reading the chapter and then listening each time I've heard you talk about it is how it puts into sharp focus just how far we could swing to the right in particular, what that could look like, and how, I saw this, I was in Nuremberg last summer and went to the museum where they kind of talk about the rise of National Socialism, and incredible to see the mechanisms that were used then and how they're being paralleled in various countries, and how it just was allowed to happen, how no one really stopped it because everyone thought it wouldn't go too far, and then it went too far and no one could stop it. And that's the concern, is what happens if you go to the kind of the American Reich model, and who gets left behind, how big is the collateral damage, what happens to minorities in America. So many questions come up that are really quite scary. And then equally in your Great Depression scenario, they kind of raise their head again because, of what could happen. And it really, it leaves me feeling quite scared, actually, about what could happen. Interestingly enough, I think George Floyd's death could be a big influencer the other way, that it could just mobilize people who don't normally vote in a way that they haven't done in the past. And I think that will probably go against the current president. Let's take some questions from the floor.
Right, if I can just respond to what you said. I agree. I think the Trump administration has very poorly played the George Floyd incident, and that's making things look hopeful for a more hopeful scenario. Like you, I was really influenced by, I was in Berlin last summer, and I went to a museum, an underground museum in Berlin that details the rise of the Nazi Party and the Reich, and I saw a lot of parallels to what was happening in the 1930s to what I was seeing here in the States, and that was one of the things that made me really concerned and also informed the writing of the scenario.
Right. I'm going to take a question from someone who hasn't asked one so far, and then I'm going to come back to some of the others. This is from Annette Gardner, and she says, Lee, business has done particularly well under the Trump presidency and will likely want to continue with the status quo. Will this tilt us towards the first scenario?
It could. Right now, Trump is way ahead in fundraising, and he has a lot of huge corporate backers. And big businesses tend to like his hands-off approach to the economy and to regulation. He's really stripped back regulations. But I think it depends on the businesses. The businesses have different perspectives as well. And I think one thing that has happened is Trump is so unpredictable that's also scaring a lot of business leaders, because they really like predictability and they really like global trade.
Right. Okay. Anyone else got a view on that? Will business just do all it can to keep Trump in power?
Well, I would agree with Lee. I think the unknown, or at least the variable that seems to be getting ratcheted up, is what's their comfort level with just no sense of consistency whatsoever. It's one thing to say, we'll eliminate all the regulations, but when you've got just the kind of chaos that goes with the current administration, how long does it become before that becomes something that becomes a disadvantage to businesses? And I think we're seeing that some with the chaos related to the protests, right? Protests are not good for business. And so pouring fire on the protest doesn't seem like a very pro-business solution to me. So we will see, but I think the variable is getting ratcheted up.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Anyone else want to come in on that? If not, let's take another question from Steve. Actually, let's merge two questions from Steve Wells. do you see a direct link between the recovery shape and the outcome of the election, or could any recovery scenario apply under either election outcome? And then secondly, what signals are there about how the health, economic, social crisis will influence the outcome of the election? So how might those factors influence the election, and could we see any of the economic recovery scenarios under either party winning?
My belief is that the faster the economy recovers, the better Trump's chances are, because often in US presidential elections, the economy is the single most important thing. And the economy has hit people really, really hard. I think that if for some reason the pandemic proves to be less deadly than thought, and there's still a lot we don't know about COVID-19, if it turns out that there's already a large number of people who've had it, who've been asymptomatic, and the businesses can open back up and we go back to business as usual, I think that favors Trump a lot. I think that if we continue to be in a big mess, that favors a different administration coming in a lot.
Okay. Anyone else want to come in on that? How the economic, social factors might influence the outcome? And could we see any of those recovery scenarios under either president?
Well, I think it's certainly true that the Trump administration is betting on the first one. I mean, that's what they're hanging their reelection on. To the extent that in places like Florida, there's some question about whether or not the numbers are even being fudged to make it look better.
Right. Surely not in Florida.
We were mentioning earlier the fact that the crisis was a health crisis, economic crisis, social crisis. I definitely think that with Trump being reelected, you can have two scenarios, like one with economic recovery and one with pursuing of economic crisis. But I think in any case, it's probably going to be a social crisis going on for long.
Alex, anything to add on that one?
Yeah, that's perfect, Sylvia. I would actually build on that, because one political and economic policy that's gained a lot of traction in America since this happened, and actually a little before then, is universal basic income. We had a candidate who was quite high profile, who was really pushing for UBI, and I think that how people perceive the economic recovery will have a lot to do with how far that idea of basic income penetrates the voting public. We got a stimulus plan where everyone got a little check, things like that are not considered normal, in American policies. It's very more European. So I think, depending on how much people take from that and how much people want to see that will determine how we interpret the recovery, and if a recovery is indeed real.
I find it very hard to believe that the US is going to see a V-shaped recovery. What I'm fascinated by is, given the likely economic malaise will last way past the election, I don't think the US is going to be back in positive growth territory before the election. How that influences the outcome? Is there any way that Trump and his supporters can present this as a victory, or will so many people have lost out that he just can't win? It would be fascinating to see. But there's another question here, which I think is a really interesting one, from Ken Hamick. He says, "Hi, last year the Atlantic devoted an entire issue to the question of how to stop a civil war. Now we have the perfect storm: COVID-19, economic shutdown, 1968-like protests, and global warming. How best to steer our way through this and its political impacts on the global economy and the cost if not successful?" Let's give you each 60 seconds on how do we steer our way through this perfect storm of crises. Who wants to go first? I'll let you go first, Lee, as it's your question.
Okay, so thanks, Ken. Great to see you online. I think the best that we can hope for is a very decisive outcome in the election. One of the things that myself and several of my fellow futurists have been discussing is, if Trump loses, will he give up power easily? We think the answer is no, because this is somebody that's almost certainly going to jail if and when he leaves office. who has already, in the last election, basically set it up where he could call foul and that the results were not clear. So if the result is close, I fully expect we'll have a constitutional crisis in the US. It could be around recounts, it could be around voting by mail, it could be around the electoral college. We have a system that is electoral system that's stacked in favor of the Republican Party. I believe The Economist estimates it takes about 54% of the popular vote to equalize out in the electoral college. So if it's any kind of close, I think we're going to have a constitutional crisis on our hands.
Alex. You're muted, Alex.
Sorry about that. I think that's a really good question, and I'm just going to say that in terms of steering our way out of it, I think we need to look to the youth, to the new generation. And in America, I think we really do need to put everything we've got into the African American community and their leadership at this time. I think that is our biggest hope right now.
Yeah. Joe.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I mean, it can look pretty dark for sure right now. I think there are two things that suggest how we get out of this. One is we have a history in this country of having significant change as a result of public protest. It has happened in the past, and we're already starting to see that at a very micro level now with some of the George Floyd protest and changing policing. The other thing that I think is really how we steer through this is that our institutions surprise us and they're more resilient than we think they are. The fact that the military has stepped up and sort of put a stake in the ground and said, we're not willing to go in the streets and shoot down other Americans is an incredibly important piece of data, I think. And so whether or not Mr. Trump wins or loses or decides he wants to leave or not leave, I don't think it's going to be his choice. And I think the institutions may actually prove to be resilient enough to get us through this crisis. That may be more hope than anything else, but right now that's how I see us weathering the storm and beginning to do some of the things Alex is talking about, which is really systemic change that we have to do if we're going to survive long term.
Sylvia.
Well, I see two ways. I see the pessimistic way, and I think, Lee, you really describe it very well by talking about the American Reich. So I've been studying German history quite a lot. I was in German school, and there are so many parallels with what happens in the 30s in Germany, 1930s in Germany. And I think that's a way to stop a civil war. That's not the way we want. But that might be the way it can happen if President Trump is reelected. And of course, there's the more optimistic way, and I want us to all act for this, if I can call on for this, which is believing in our constitution and in our institutions. And I still have hope that we can act at this level. And that includes the official institutions, but also, as we were talking about earlier, like the field, like the civic protests, civic movements.
Yeah, I think there are those two options, aren't there? One is you get the American Reich, and then you get one way of dealing with it, which is quite a brutal and oppressive way. I think the other way is if Biden gets in and really creates some sort of national recovery plan, like a Marshall Plan for America. But I think it has to look very different, because part of the issue is that structurally so much wealth is now being diverted to the richest and the tax benefits, and the system is so rigged in favor of a relatively small group of people that I think you'd have to rejig financial markets, you'd have to rejig the tax system, you'd have to rejig monetary policy, and that means you're talking about rejigging global systems, because you can't just say, well, we're going to change what goes on in America, because you carry so much debt from Japan and China and the rest of the world that anything you do to rejig is going to have massive global ramifications. But I also feel that, and there's other chapters in the book that talk about this, that we probably need that for the planet, that we've reached the point where we've stretched the systems just too far. Too many people are left out, and we need to bring it back to something that's more equal, more inclusive and more sustainable. So is this a good time to share the results of your poll? Let's see what people said.
Sure. And Rohit, I think COVID-19 is bringing all those issues you just talked about into stark focus.
Right, for sure. So any surprise here, Lee? And now you can tell us what you thought.
Well, my vote is personally for rough sledding, so I'm with the majority of our poll respondents. I think that's what we're going to see.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, I think there's a chance of the Great Depression, the L shape, but the L is, the problem is that there's no way out of the L. You have to then stick something on the end, the Nike swoosh on the end.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the global institutions, the owners of wealth and power, just couldn't live with that. There will be a mobilization. I think Joe said this. At some point, people will just say, no, we're going to throw everything we can at this to pull it back up. Let's not worry about debt or whatever. And there's so many people involved here, like the sovereign wealth funds. They need somewhere to put their money. So they might as well lend it to economies like the US to pull itself out of trouble. But you could end up with your guaranteed basic income and all sorts of things. And we have nearly 9 million people on a guaranteed income at the moment here.
I do think the chance of the Greatest Depression is higher than zero.
Yeah.
I still believe that could happen. And I also believe that the more we have a W-shaped recovery, the more difficult it gets, because we've thrown a lot of government resources at the pandemic at the first wave. We're going to have a more limited ability to do so with subsequent waves, especially because government income is really down from taxes and from business and the normal things that people do. So the longer it goes on in waves, the harder it will be for us to effectively deal with it.
Okay, I'm going to give you, we've got a few questions just come in. I'm going to give one to each of you to answer, because we don't have time for everyone to answer all of them, and I'm going to pick them at random. Let's go with Sylvia. Steve Wells's question: do we trust companies or governments more?
Who's we? Yeah,
Society.
I guess. Companies, it depends which company. Some companies are really close to governments, so it's kind of the same. I'm thinking of Facebook, maybe. I don't know.
Okay. I've got one for you now, Joe. I'm going to give you Steve Wells again. Is this election any different to the last election in that the lesser of two undesirable candidates should win? How will real change emerge?
Well, I do think there's some differences. In fact, the latest poll results I saw has Biden at 55% favorability, which is higher than Hillary ever was. And I think he continues to have a widespread likability, which I think there's a big difference there. The second question is where will real change happen? At some level, part of what we're seeing in the United States is the old guard, my generation, fighting not to give up control. We will give up control because we'll die out, apparently, from COVID-19. And I am really optimistic by some of the things I'm seeing from the younger generation of politicians, not just at the national level, but even here in Florida. We've got some real firecrackers who are in their late 20s, early 30s, and they are just not backing down from addressing these issues and talking about systemic change. So I think long-term, if we can avoid the Great Depression and avoid destroying everything, I think we do have an optimistic future. I think it's the near term that's much more challenging.
Okay, I'm going to give this one to you, Lee, from Annette Gardner. And she says, what is the intersection of the four scenarios and climate change? Does it act as a damper on all four scenarios?
No, I think it really depends on how different administrations deal with it. I think in the renewal scenario, you might see a huge investment, Marshall Plan in investing in infrastructure and in alternate energy sources, where that, investment could be used as a way to really fight climate change in a much more foresightful government. I think in the American Reich, climate change looms large as a problem that's being ignored and subverted.
Cool. And Alex, you get the last question from Ray Taylor. I don't know if he's still here or not. He says, would be great to hear short and medium-term thought about education. After all, who would risk paying for and starting a non-online degree this October? Where are we going with education? What's going to happen to student numbers, enrollment, all those kinds of things?
Well, the interesting thing about it is it's going to be different everywhere. Depends on where you look. I've heard, some universities are going back in the fall. Many are not going back at all next year. And then there's, in the US anyway, all these little bitty school systems all around the country that are making up their own decisions. So it's not going to be uniform. And short term, I think it's going to be catch up right now. I think that at least talking about anyone under 18, this disruption is something they're going to have to overcome. Teachers, administrators, we need to plan for overcoming and fixing that gap. I've read studies that say some kids lost up to the equivalent of a year of school in those, 3 months, I guess.
Wow.
Yeah.
So thank you all. I'm putting out one final poll. This is a quick 30-second poll for everyone as we close out. Just share your thoughts on which areas do you think will see the biggest positive change? Because we've had a little bit of negativity. Not negativity, but we talked about some kind of gloomy issues today. Which of these is going to be there? I'm not going to show any slides to close out, but I just want to thank all of our panelists, Joe, Sylvia, Alex, and Lee, for talking really beautifully about their own chapters, sharing the content without giving it all away, but getting us to think about some of the bigger issues at play, and for them being so willing to talk about anything and everything that's come up in the Q&A and to discuss each other's chapters. Thank you all for your questions, your comments, your feedback. And just remind you, I'm not going to put slides up of forthcoming events. There's the Recovery Summit tomorrow, which has 6,000 people signed up. Incredible. And let's see how many turn up. But if you want to find out about all the forthcoming webinars that we're running, just go to our website, fastfuture.com, where you'll also find the book, Aftershocks and Opportunities, Scenarios for a Post-Pandemic Future. A great read. I've read it about 9 times myself, and it's brilliant. So do go buy it. It's available there and in Amazon and or on Amazon. So let's share the polling from this final question. Which area do we see the most biggest positive change? Well, citizen engagement in politics, followed by diversity, inclusion and treatment of minorities. Least positive seems to be support and learning opportunities for the unemployed, and environment and sustainability, which is a bit of a shame. Also, not much hope that we're going to be better at preparing for the next crisis. Interesting stuff. So I'm going to end there. Thank you all for joining us. Do come to future webinars. They're all as good as this. The contributors are all fantastic, all very eloquent, all very wide thinking in their ideas. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you to the panel. See you all. And have a good rest of the evening, wherever you are, or day.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Great